We are continuing on with Chapter 32, the cardiovascular system, and we have moved on to Section 3, the human cardiovascular system. We looked at some of the structures of the human heart, and now here are the notes on those structures. There are 4 valves in the human heart that prevent blood from regurgitating or going backwards, I guess you could say, in the pathway. The atrioventricular valves, or AV valves, are used to make sure that once blood has left the atria and entered the ventricles, that it doesn't go backwards into the atria or regurgitate back into the atria. So these valves are called the tricuspid valve, that's on the right side of the heart between the right atrium and ventricle, and the bicuspid or mitral valve, that's on the left side of the heart. 2 other valves prevent the blood from moving back into the ventricles from the major arteries. So once the ventricles pump the blood out of the heart into the arteries, it won't come back and flow backwards into the ventricles. These are called semilunar valves because the flaps on these valves are shaped like half moons. The pulmonary semilunar valve, which we just call the pulmonary valve for short, is between the right ventricle and the pulmonary trunk, and it prevents blood from going back into the falling back into the right ventricle. And the aortic valve is between the left ventricle and the aorta, and it prevents blood from falling back into the left ventricle. So this is actually the diagram that shows you those internal structures of the heart. I like this diagram a lot better because when I'm trying to teach pathway of blood flow through the heart, you can see the structures that I'm naming. So let's start in the right atrium. This is the same view that we had, the anterior view of the heart, except that there's it's been sliced through so you can see the interior structures. So we have blood entering the right atrium from the systemic circuit. This blood is oxygen poor blood. It is going to flow through the tricuspid valve into the right ventricle. And then there's these structures. You may have heard of heartstrings. Well, they're actually called chordae tendineae that connect the AV valves to muscles called papillary muscles and keep those valves closed. So the blood flows from the right ventricle through the tricuspid valve. Let me start over. The blood flows from the right atrium through the tricuspid valve into the right ventricle. And then you can see very clearly how it flows past the pulmonary valve, the pulmonary semilunar valve, into the pulmonary trunk, and now into the pulmonary arteries and to the lungs. And it's going to pick up oxygen in the lungs, come back to the heart through those pulmonary veins into the left atrium, pass through the bicuspid valve or mitral valve into the left ventricle. And you can see here how the walls of the left ventricle are much thicker. The left ventricle has to pump very, very hard, has to pump blood out through the aorta to the whole entire systemic circuit. So the rest of the body, all the way from your head to the top of your head to the tips of your toes. So it's just got to be a stronger pump because the right ventricle is only having to pump directly to the left and right of the heart, to the lungs. So anyway, blood is flowing from the left ventricle through the bicuspid or mitral valve. I don't know why I do that. I don't mean to confuse you. It's the left atrium through the bicuspid or mitral valve to the left ventricle. And then it's pumped out and it kind of goes behind here, behind that pulmonary trunk into the aorta, pumped to the rest of the body, and then it comes back to the right side of the heart through the inferior vena cava and the superior vena cava into the right atrium. Okay, so I think we said all the structures. If there's anything I left out, I just want to go through very quickly. Septum, this is just the divider here between the left and right ventricle. It's called the interventricular septum. And I think everything else we went through. So we're going to move on. This is the pathway of blood flow through the human heart that I just typed out so you could have it, and you need to learn it. So it's right atrium, past the tricuspid valve, to the right ventricle, past the pulmonary valve. And as you're going through this list, it would be great if you could open this up, and also be able to recite this list as you point to the structures in figure 32.8. That's how you're really going to learn it. But it's right atrium, right ventricle, past the pulmonary valve to the pulmonary trunk and arteries, to the lungs, back to the heart through the pulmonary veins, into the left atrium of the heart, past the mitral valve or bicuspid valve, into the left ventricle, past the aortic valve to the aorta, to the systemic circuit, and then back to the heart through the superior and inferior vena cava into the right atrium. And then this cycle just goes on and on. As far as the heartbeat, there are two sounds, lup dup, lup dup, lup dup, like that over and over and over. The first sound is harder. It's a louder and a more forceful sound. So the first sound the first heart sound is a result of the closing of the AV valves. They kind of slam shut like a screen door. And the dup, the second heart sound, is because of the closing of the semilunar valves, and that's a softer sound. Now, the stages of the heart cycle, basically it's contraction, relaxation over and over again. Systole is contraction of the heart chambers, and diastole is relaxation of the heart chambers. So when the heart is in systole, it's pumping blood, and when it's in diastole, it's receiving and filling up with blood. So the cardiac cycle takes about a second, and it's just basically these cycles of contracting and relaxing. And this shows you, in this, I like this because it kind of shows you the valves when they're open and when they're closed. So for the stages of the cardiac cycle, first of all, what we have in A is we have the blood is flowing into the ventricles from the atria. So this is the diastole. And the AV valves are open, but the semilunar valves are closed because we don't want any blood going out yet. We aren't pumping blood out. We're just receiving all the blood we can into the ventricles. And then these AV valves are going to close. The tricuspid and bicuspid valves are going to close. And that kind of happens. Okay. So it happens in stage B. So in stage A, the blood is flowing into the ventricles through those open AV valves, but the semilunar valves are closed. So then in stage B, the AV valves are going to close and the semilunar valves are going to open so that the ventricles can pump blood out. The right ventricle pumps blood out the pulmonary trunk, and the left ventricle pumps blood out the aorta. So that's going to be the systole stage, the contraction stage. And then what you have in C is the closing of the semilunar valves, and you'll hear that dup. The lub is the closing of the AV valves, and then the dub is the closing of the semilunar valves. And after that, you're going to have the filling stage, or the diastole, where the heart chambers begin filling with blood. And then this is just an actual photograph of the semilunar valve, the aortic valve, and it's closed here. And then here, the bicuspid valve, and I can't really tell. It's hard to tell in this picture, but it's just showing you a picture. I can tell you that the aortic valve is closed in this picture for sure. And it looks like the bicuspid valve is open, the bicuspid or mitral valve. So let's go on to a little bit about the pulse and the conduction system of the heart. The electrical system of the heart helps to maintain the heart rate. So The pulse is defined as a wave effect passing down the walls of the arterial blood vessels, called arteries, when the aorta expands and recoils following ventricular systole. So in other words, after the heart contracts, then the aorta expands and recoils, and that's what leads to a pulse. Rhythmic contraction of the atria and ventricles is due to the internal or intrinsic conduction system of the heart. The conduction system of the heart begins with the pacemaker of the heart, called the sinoatrial node or SA node, and it keeps the heartbeat regular. It sets the pace for the heartbeat. It's called the pacemaker. And then the atrioventricular node follows. Basically, electrical signal is sent, begins at the SA node, and then it's sent to the AV node. Both of these are located in the right atrium, but the AV node is closer to the ventricle, closer to where you're going to find the AV valves, the tricuspid and bicuspid valves. Anyway, the AV node signals the ventricles to contract. So the SA node signals the heart to, signals the heartbeat and sets the heart rate. And then the AV node, once the signal passes to the AV node, it signals the contraction of the ventricles and the pumping of the blood. There are two hormones that help to regulate heart rate by stimulating the heart, causing it to beat faster and causing it to contract with more force. And they're called epinephrine and norepinephrine, also known as adrenaline and noradrenaline. And they're actually produced by the adrenal glands, which sit on top of the kidneys. We have a way to measure the electrical activity of the heart and the conduction system of the heart with an EKG or ECG or electrocardiogram. It's a recording of the electrical changes that occur in the myocardium, which is the heart muscle, during the cardiac cycle. And there are three peaks that you should be familiar with. There's the P wave, the QRS complex, and the T wave. So whenever you see the P wave, when you see that blip on the heart monitor, that means the atria are about to contract. They're going to contract and push all the blood they can into the ventricles. And then you're going to have the slamming shut of those AV valves, of the tricuspid and bicuspid valves. Then the QRS represents the ventricles contracting. So once you see that peak, immediately following the QRS peak, you're going to see, you would see that the ventricles contracted if you could actually watch the heart. And then you're going to have the T wave, which represents that, that's the electrical impulse that signals the atria to relax. So ventricles to relax. So P is the atria contracting. QRS is ventricles contracting. And the atria actually relax during that stage, but it's just the ventricles contracting kind of overpowers the atria relaxing. And the T wave represents that the ventricles are about to relax. So, and here are the notes on that. The P wave indicates the atria are about to contract. The QRS signals that the ventricles are about to contract. And at the same time, the atria are relaxing. And the T wave is due to electrical changes occurring as the ventricular muscle fibers recover. So it signals that the ventricles are about to relax. Again, the pulmonary circuit functions to take oxygen-poor blood to the lungs and return oxygen-rich blood to the heart. The systemic circuit takes oxygen-rich blood from the heart to tissues and returns oxygen-poor blood to the heart through the vena cava. And here is the pathway of blood flow. It actually shows all of the major structures. It just doesn't list the chambers of the heart, and it doesn't list the heart valves, but it lists all the, the pathway that the blood takes through the pulmonary circuit, which is at the top part of the diagram, and then the systemic circuit, which is the lower part. All right, and then blood pressure. Normally, blood pressure is measured with a sphygmomanometer or blood pressure cuff, and it's placed on the upper arm, and you force air into it, squeezing an artery called the brachial artery. And you basically, when you are listening with a stethoscope, while you're measuring someone's blood pressure, you can hear the time, you can look at where the needle is on the blood pressure cuff. When you hear the first heartbeat, that's going to represent the systolic pressure, which is the higher pressure in the brachial artery. And then the last heartbeat that you hear in the stethoscope is going to represent the diastolic pressure. And so you express the systolic over the diastolic. The systolic would be the higher pressure, diastolic would be the lower pressure. And blood pressure is measured in millimeters of mercury. Blood pressure in the veins is too low to move blood back to the heart. So the veins have, there's a way to get blood back to the heart. Number one, skeletal muscle contraction squeezes the veins. That is why we need to exercise for our circulatory system. But it squeezes those veins and pushes blood back to the heart, and the valves in the veins keep the blood from flowing backward. When those valves become ineffective, we get varicose veins. And another thing that helps to kind of pull blood up to the heart is the respiratory pump. As we breathe, the higher pressure in our abdominal cavity pushes that blood up to our thoracic cavity where there's lower pressure every time we inhale. So that's called the respiratory pump. And this graph just shows you that blood pressure is higher in arteries, and then it gets lower in arterioles, lower in capillaries, venules, and it's the lowest in veins. This is showing you how skeletal muscles squeeze against the veins and help to push blood up back to the heart.